My godfather took everything, then let my grandparents die alone. After Christmas in 2024, my grandmother, my dad's mom, was hospitalized because of a blood clot. She had always had problems with overly thick blood and had previously been treated in the vascular surgery department for similar issues. Usually, I was the one who drove my grandparents to doctor's appointments. I'm the oldest granddaughter, the first in the family to get a driver's license, and I inherited my dad's driving skills. He's a professional truck driver. But this time, I was away for New Year's with my boyfriend, so my younger brother took my grandma to the hospital. Grandma ended up staying there for quite a long time. She had surgery on the leg where the clot had formed, and the wound wasn't healing well. My grandfather was almost 80 and was afraid to drive alone to the big city where the hospital was. So we started taking him to visit her. Twice a week we drove there, on weekends with my parents, and during the week just my grandfather and us grandkids. We would bring her clean clothes and food. The trip took about an hour each way. My dad has a younger brother, my godfather, who inherited the family house and most of the property. Logically, you'd think that in a situation like this, he would be the one helping take care of my grandparents. But since my grandparents had never refused me anything, I didn't mind helping. At the time I was unemployed, I actually enjoyed driving, and my grandfather was happy to pay for fuel. But more importantly, my grandparents had taken care of us when we were little. My mom didn't have a driver's license and often stayed alone with us while my dad was working. I also believe that kindness tends to come back to you somehow, whether from people or from life itself. February was chaotic. At the beginning of the month, my boyfriend had to have his appendix removed, which was stressful for me. On the day of his surgery, I also managed to get stuck in the hospital elevator. The morning he was supposed to leave the hospital, I was home alone cooking a light soup for him. My grandfather came by to call my grandmother. They only had one mobile phone, and she had taken it to the hospital. My grandpa managed fine without one most of the time. He could drive to the store or come visit us, but it meant he had no way to contact her. We sat and talked for a while. Looking back, I sometimes wonder, why did he have to come to my house to make a phone call when he lived with his daughter-in-law and two grandsons who was always home? Either he didn't want to ask them, or they wouldn't give him the phone, even if he did. At some point, he mentioned that he had a headache. Something about it bothered me, but I wasn't feeling great myself that day either, so I blamed it on the weather. The next day, my parents and my uncle took him to the ER with suspected stroke symptoms. Later, receipts were found in his car from that same day he visited me. On the way home, he had stopped at a store and bought 2 half-liter bottles of vodka. My grandfather had struggled with alcohol since I was a child. That stroke was his 4th. Around that time, my grandmother finally recovered enough to come home from the hospital. Now we were the ones driving her to visit my grandfather. He was supposed to be sent to a rehabilitation center, but the prognosis wasn't good. He had serious vision problems after the stroke, and the damage seemed permanent. While he was in rehab, my grandma decided she needed to repaint the house and do some renovations so that everything would look nicer when he returned. She refused our offer to come help her and started doing it herself. She ended up back in the hospital again. This time, another clot had blocked blood flow to part of her intestines, causing necrosis. Doctors had to remove about 1 meter of her intestine, and she was put into a medically induced coma for a long time. It wasn't clear whether she would survive. During that time, my uncle's wife frequently called my mom to update her about Grandma's condition. I won't go into detail about this woman, but she's a manipulative and deeply selfish person who has been tearing the family apart since she married my godfather. Before she appeared in our lives, the family got along well. Afterward, there was constant conflict. When she called my mom, she said things like, "Grandma probably won't survive. Doctors have no hope. We should start thinking about the funeral." But when my dad called the hospital himself, the doctors told him her condition was actually improving. 2 weeks later, when doctors started waking my grandma from the coma, my uncle called my dad and told him he needed to take Grandma into our home and care for her. My dad refused. For over 10 years, we had already been caring for 2 of my grandfather's intellectually disabled brothers. They were elderly and retired, and we had inherited responsibility for them after my great-grandmother died. In return, we inherited the house and land where we built our home. Taking care of them was exhausting, and we had been doing it for more than a decade. My dad told his brother that since their parents had financially supported him for years, it was only fair that he now take care of them in their old age. My uncle replied that they already had to deal with Grandpa. That was still only one person, and as it later turned out, not for long. My dad refused again. My uncle responded with a threat. I'll show you who's really in charge. Sometime later, we learned that after returning from rehabilitation, my grandfather had been placed by my uncle in a long-term care facility. In my country, those places have a terrible reputation. They're something like hospices, but with far worse staffing and care. It's not really the fault of the nurses, the system simply doesn't provide enough staff. People there are often lonely and neglected. My grandpa missed home terribly and cried out at night, keeping other patients awake. Because of that, he was given extremely high doses of sedatives. Slowly, his mind began to fade. During this time, my grandmother left the hospital, but we had no contact with her anymore. Apparently, her phone had broken, and she was only allowed to call some older aunts. As far as we suspect, she was forbidden from contacting us. Now we come to the most spiteful part of the story. My grandmother had a brother with schizophrenia. She had always taken care of him, although my uncle used him for farm labor. That brother owned a piece of farmland that my grandparents had always promised to divide between me and my cousin. He had no children, so eventually the inheritance would have been shared among the family anyway. But from the moment my cousin and I were born, my grandma had always said that specific land would go to the two of us. Her brother wasn't capable of managing the property himself. Left alone, he probably would have bought 15 televisions, a pack of German Shepherds, and spent his days watching old World War II shows while eating bacon and sugar straight from the package. That's genuinely the kind of priorities he had. Remember my uncle's threat to my dad? It turned out he didn't show my dad who was in charge. He showed me. As I said, my dad's brother is my godfather. A godfather is supposed to support and guide and support their godchild, right? Mine didn't. I had plans for that land, investment plans. In spring, we received a letter from a notary. Because my grandma's brother needed to lease the farmland to receive certain benefits, my dad had been leasing the half that was supposed to go to me. The letter informed us the lease was being terminated. The land was being sold. In June, my grandfather's condition deteriorated dramatically. When I visited him for the last time, I barely recognized him. Months of sedatives, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling. It had drained the life out of him. I'll never forget his face. His eyes were wide and terrified. Standing in that room, I felt the presence of death in the air. A few days later, he died. We didn't hear it from family. We heard it from strangers. My uncle never informed my father that his own parent had died. At that point, we still had no contact with my grandmother. My dad tried to visit her at the house. The gate was locked with a thick chain and padlock. She had been completely isolated from us. No one knew what was happening with her. She wasn't even at my grandfather's funeral. Other relatives tried to visit her too, but they also couldn't get through. At the funeral, I looked my godfather in the eyes. Even I was startled by the contempt in my own expression. But I admit I felt some satisfaction when he was the first to look away. Walking from the church to the cemetery, by pure coincidence, we ended up directly behind the coffin. My mom heard my aunt whisper something behind us, and my uncle replied, "Just let it go." Apparently she couldn't, because she rushed ahead to make sure they were the ones walking directly behind the coffin instead of us. Sometime after the funeral, my grandma finally called my mom from a stranger's phone. She was back in the hospital. When we visited her, she said she wanted to go to heaven like my grandfather. To this day, we don't know what happened during the months when she was completely cut off from us. A friend of my mom works at that hospital and quietly kept her informed about Grandma's condition. Later, we learned that Grandma had fallen, hit her head, and was in another coma. There were kilograms of candy in her hospital drawer. After losing part of her intestine, she should have been on a very strict diet. In July, she died. 1 month after my grandfather, this time, my cousin sent my dad a text message that simply said, "Grandma is dead." The funeral was just as bitter and unpleasant as my grandpa's. I couldn't even grieve properly until months later. At the time, the sadness and the atmosphere of death were buried under anger and betrayal.